David Seymour.
Mr Speaker, it gives me great pleasure to, Mr Chair, rise on behalf of the ACT Party in opposition to this bill. And I notice a slight contradiction in the two New Zealand First bills that have been presented and soon to be voted down tonight. The first one was about Parliament introducing a statute to undermine an agreement or a contract entered into by the Crown. And the second is based on the claim that the Crown is about to sign away all democratic rights and that somehow we will no longer be a democracy. I just asked members to ponder if the first bill was going to be effective, then why is the second one needed? I'll give them a moment. Actually, I don't have enough time for them to get that. But fundamentally, the supporters of this bill and opponents of free trade, I have to say, tend to be of a certain type. Those who wear tinfoil hats are worried about chemtrails from trains and think that 9/11 was an inside job. And more specifically, they tend not to understand the concept of limits to democracy and limits to democratic decision-making. The fact is that in the normal course of things, the majority does not rule unencumbered without due process, without property rights, or without any type of regulatory restraint. In fact, one would hope that when a government or a parliament makes laws, it would do it with respect to all of those things. In fact, one would hope that when a government regulated, it would do correct problem definition, that it would identify impacts on free trade and property rights, that it would identify winners and losers, that it would do cost-benefit analysis on a variety of different options for regulating. That is what we would all hope were the limits of legislation passed by a majority. And that is something that people who are in favour of this bill tonight and opposed to the TPPA and ISDS tend to have a real problem with. But they have an even bigger problem when those constraints on the tyranny of the majority might in fact be put in place or pursued by people who are not part of New Zealand, because they are already opposed to limits on the tyranny of the majority. They are already sceptical about property rights and due process, and they are even more sceptical about foreigners. Well, the fact is that New Zealand is a trading nation. We've heard it so many times before. But what we need to realise is that New Zealand, as a jurisdiction of around 5 million people, is comparable to, say, British Columbia or Colorado or Denmark. And if one was to go to any of those jurisdictions and say, why don't you pull out of your effective free trade agreement and your integration of laws and regulations with Canada in the case of BC, or the United States in the case of Colorado, or the EU in the case of Denmark? Because if you don't, if you continue to be integrated into this wider market, then you have no democracy and your grandchildren have been sold out. They'd say that you are nuts, to quote them, not to address the chair. And I say precisely the same thing to those members tonight. In actual fact, throughout our history, we as New Zealanders have gained from being able to enforce free trade agreements, even to the chagrin of foreign governments. I did only mention the long-running Apple case to say that we are a trading nation that believes in limits to government, and we realise that when we integrate with the rest of the world, some of those limits will be pursued by other governments, and the state will not be acting on behalf of corporations. They're going to have to do it themselves, which seems to be a step backwards from their point of view, Mr Parker. But nonetheless, for all of those reasons, I'm very proud to stand and oppose this rather sad and all too short and poorly thought out wee bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.